Good evening and welcome. I'm Jane Wald, Executive Director of the Emily Dickinson Museum, and I'm so glad that you're joining us this evening for a wonderful program that we are delighted to share with you. We're coming to you from the Homestead Parlor, which has been recently restored, as you may well know, and so you're getting kind of a long view glimpse of it tonight, so you can enjoy the restoration just as we are. We're bringing to you tonight the first in a three-part series, Behind the Scenes with Collections. So this program explores some of the work being done with our collections that's come about through a three-year project to catalog the entire collection from start to finish for the very first time. I'll be joined tonight by Nan Wolverton, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, and also by our collections manager, Megan Ramsey, who has been overseeing and doing so much of the work of the collections cataloging project. Before we get started, I'll just remind you that there will be a Q&A session after the end of this program. So we encourage you to place your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find with your Zoom tool in that toolbar. And we'll take those questions toward the end of our program. So I'm delighted to welcome Nan Wolverton, who is Vice President for Academic and Public Programs at the American Antiquarian Society, where she oversees fellowships and organizes conferences, seminars, and workshops related to visual culture. She served as a lecturer in American Studies at Smith College, and as executive director at Historic Northampton Museum and Education Center. She was also curator of decorative arts at Old Sturbridge Village, where we overlapped for a bit of time. So I'm delighted that you're with us, Nan. Nan has been acquainted with the Emily Dickinson Museum for quite some time and serves on our collections committee and is the author of our furnishings plan, which is a wonderful kind of guide and roadmap in helping us with our restoration efforts, both at the homestead and at the Evergreens. So I'm going to set the stage for you just briefly to kind of get us into why our work with collections right now is so important. How long we've been at it and what we hope to accomplish in the years ahead. So I'm going to take you back 20 years to the founding of the Emily Dickinson Museum. So this is our 20th anniversary year, and we're so pleased to be continuing with some of the important work that we envisioned all that time ago. So 20 years ago, when the homestead and the Evergreens came together, we had an opportunity to consider very seriously and practically for the very first time how to integrate the assets that each of these two historic sites brought to a partnership. So the two separate sites were the Dickinson Homestead and the Evergreens, both of them Dickinson family homes, but they were owned and operated separately. So it made all kinds of sense, of course, that they be joined to become one single unified Dickinson site. So that's what happened in 2003. So much of our attention at that time was focused on kind of uncovering the hidden collection at the Evergreens and employing it more usefully between both houses. But the collection of objects at the Evergreens was vast. There were only a few dozen objects here at the homestead at the time, so the rooms were quite sparsely furnished. But that vast, almost overwhelming collection at the Evergreens was put away in boxes. Some of those objects had probably never been seen in perhaps decades. So we had a big task ahead of us to figure out what we had in the collection and to deploy it most usefully between the two houses. Our efforts with collections were mirrored by similar efforts with our interpretation at the houses, which again, we wanted to merge together, and our efforts at understanding the historic significance of our landscape, which again, these two separate lots, two separate properties, which had been united in the 19th century, had been separate for quite some time. So all of these efforts across the campus, the structures, the interpretation, and the collections, all our efforts were really bent toward creating a more unified story that could be told with objects. And that is where Nan Wolverton came in to help us. Our first effort there was to obtain a grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services that gave us the resources to address several of the items that I've just listed. And among those was the creation of a furnishings plan. So the purpose of the furnishings plan was really to address the imbalance of objects between the two houses. And the way a furnishings plan functions is that it is a room by room inventory of objects that are appropriate to the story that is to be told in that space. It's supported, the inventory has an image of the object. It has notes as to the source of information about the object, and kind of a key, a map of how the object should be arrayed in that space. As you can see behind us right now, the furnishings plan has been applied, certainly been applied very beautifully here in the homestead parlor. And we'll have a little bit more to say about how a furnishings plan is implemented in a few minutes. But first, since Nan did all of this wonderful work, and I've just described what I thought was a rather overwhelming collection. I'm wondering what you thought about it when you first encountered it, and whether we made it seem like a feasible project or a challenging one.
Well, I think it's made it seem like it certainly was a challenging project, but it was a very enjoyable project. I will say that. I had worked with other collections that had house museums, house collections that had been in some cases cataloged, in some cases not cataloged. But this was walking into the Evergreens and seeing the rooms, particularly rooms upstairs, full of objects, was to some degree overwhelming, but also the promise of what could be found there was really exciting for me. It was a challenge, and yeah, it was really quite memorable. I mean, this was a long time ago now, but my memories of it, that it was fun to be going through the collections. And what was, I think, what made it seem very exciting was the fact that these were collections, these were materials that came from one family, essentially, the Dickinson family, and that was really unusual. So a great opportunity to really dive in and really get a sense of what was in the two houses and try to sort out what had been moved over to the Evergreens from the homestead. So a welcome challenge, I would say.
Good. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. So how did you go about the research? I mean, as you mentioned, walking into the Evergreens is just sort of an astonishing experience for the first time, but also every time I walk in there, I'm astonished. But did you start with objects, or did you start with other kinds of resources? How did you go about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I did it sort of in tandem. That is, the objects themselves are really of prime importance, obviously, and just such a rich and wonderful collection. but I also knew that in order to get a better sense of the kinds of things that we needed to know to interpret what was in both of the houses and in each of the rooms within the houses, that I needed to do some archival research as well. So that meant going to 4 archives that housed Dickinson family materials. So that was materials at the Houghton Library at Harvard, the John Hay Library at Brown University, the Archives and Special Collections here at Amherst College, and the Special Collections at the Jones Library here in Amherst. So each of these repositories had a wide variety of materials related to the Dickinsons. And so I spent a fair amount of time digging through those materials, but also reading through published sources, all of the published letters and materials that had been, there's so much that has been published on Dickinson, but wonderful background information. But I found the letters to be exceedingly useful. But it was not a process that was that involved sort of going to the archive first and then going to the objects. I was doing some of each, and I can explain when we look at some images later. I think you'll see how in some cases that worked out quite well to be doing it that way.
Yeah, in fact, yeah. So a lot of kind of back and forth, developing foundational information, and then you'd find a little more and build up.
And taking copious notes and trying to keep track of each room within the house in going through the materials. It sometimes felt like I was looking for a needle in a haystack, just trying to read through letters and find references to where something was purchased, something that is mentioned in a room that just happens to be, you know, it's always very exciting when you come across it. It could take a little while, but I would make notes of that and then associate that with the space so that I could then gradually build within each of the rooms what may have been there. So it was a process.
Right. Yeah. So all of these materials, archival and printed and published, you know, other researchers and other writers go through these materials with other themes or topics in mind, I think. But your work, I think, is probably the most thorough in going through this range of resources, really focused on the material culture of the 2 houses. Did you have a sense of the uniqueness of your particular project, your particular effort?
I mean, I guess I didn't really think of it in terms of whether it was unique or not. I had a goal I needed to accomplish. But you're right about, you know, the aim was really trying to think. I mean, we did have interpretive themes we were looking for the we sort of knew there were things that we wanted to communicate about Dickinson in both of the houses, and thinking about the time periods to interpret as well within the spaces, which to some degree had to be determined by the objects that we had. I mean, I think I felt that it was at sometimes it seemed that if it could take a while to get at the information that I was looking for, but then when you find that nugget, then you realize this is really, yes, maybe it's unusual, and that the sort of searching, but then I think a lot of researchers often feel that they are looking for something that no one else has thought about looking for, or they feel like they might be going down rabbit holes when they should be doing something else, but they're tempted by something that might be related to what they're interested in. So I think it's part of research. It has to be, you have to be sort of open-minded and I guess just expect that you're not quite sure what direction you're going to go in. And though I had my goals, I don't think it probably was that different from the way a lot of researchers feel when they're looking for or researching a topic, and just sometimes feels if it's taking a while to get it, what they are hoping to find.
Yeah. So finding that nugget, were there certain, you know, memorable objects, memorable moments in the process?
Yes, there were. And you know, again, this is a while ago, but they there are some things that still stand out as being quite memorable. And we have some images. We could go to those now and talk about some of the images, if you like.
That's a great idea.
Would that be a good segue?
let's-
Okay.
Let's see some of those.
Because one of the objects that I think could be, it's very hard to, how can one identify an object that is a favorite or not? But
Yeah, you know, it just occurred to me that there is one thing I wanted to.
okay,
There's
yeah.
one thing I wanted to show our audience before we get to
Yes.
specific objects.
Yes.
And that's sort of going back to the purpose of a furnishings plan and how it's implemented.
Mhm.
And we have I believe we have a photograph of the Homestead Library before Nan's work took place. This is the Homestead Library back in probably 2005. And you can see how spare it is.
Yeah.
It's the comb back rocker there on the left, and the center table. Both of those objects actually originated at the Evergreens. And there are more things like that you found.
Mhm.
But then we can take a look at the kind of the end of the process after the furnishings plan is prepared, and objects are identified that are, you know, housed at the Evergreens, but actually more suitable and perhaps even historically originated at the homestead. This is more of what we see. So that kind of before and after, I think, gives our viewers a sense of what our objective was in creating the furnishings plan and then implementing it in a kind of an ongoing process as we go along.
Well, and I think your question about memorable moments, I mean, when I see these images, I'm reminded of how memorable it was to see these spaces furnished in ways that just it just transformed them, and that is really rewarding to see that. So in some ways, those moments are the best, to see the fruition of the project.
That's right.
Yeah.
Let's see. I saw in the chat a question that I want to answer right now because of the photograph of the library we just saw with the bookcase. There's a fairly full bookcase in that space, and the question was: are the books in the library original, and are they cataloged? And those books actually are part of a special project at the Emily Dickinson Museum to recreate the Dickinson family library and the books in that library from book lists that actually do exist. The titles are known, the editions are known. The books themselves are housed partly at Harvard University and partly at Brown University for historical reasons. A story that is maybe a little too long to go into right now. But our concern here is to identify and acquire the very same editions that the Dickinson family owned. And so that project is called Replenishing the Shelves of the Dickinson Libraries. So those were the books that you saw in that photograph just a moment ago.
So important to have books in the library.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, you can't have an Emily Dickinson house without books. So perhaps some memorable moments, objects.
Okay, we can look at some objects now. We do have there are a few images that might help to tell some of these stories a bit more. And you know, you asked about objects. There's so many wonderful pieces in the collections, but this is one that really stood out for me in terms of the process. This is an Aeolian harp, and what was so memorable about this for me was that process of that I mentioned earlier, reading through letters and then looking at spending time going through materials at the Evergreens. I had read a letter that a couple of letters that Emily Dickinson had written one to Austin, I believe, and the other to her cousin, John Graves, making reference to an Aeolian harp that to Austin's letter stating that John Graves had made them a harp and sent it to them, and it played beautifully alone. And a few days later, I was in the garret space of the Evergreens, walking through a collection of old chairs and trunks, and this object was on the floor, pretty dusty, but I knew immediately what it was because I had just recently read that letter, and it was one of those moments that was just remarkable for me to say, because of the connection to Dickinson. Such, I knew it was an important object for the museum to be able to showcase. It was missing its strings. You see, it has the strings on it now, but the museum got it beautifully restored and had it restrung. And this was intended to be put under an open window in a parlor, so that the breeze could, the wind coming through the window could create the music. So it doesn't require someone playing it. It's all done by the wind, hence the name Aeolian harp. And it creates this beautiful ethereal music. And what I loved too is then you'll see in the upper right corner this little sketch that Emily made, thanking her cousin John Graves for making this and sending it to her. She made some little wristlets for him, so knitted striped wristlets in exchange as a gift for him. But she made this little sketch at the top that says, "In memory of Aeolus." And in her whimsical way, she has created both a headstone and a footstone, and a pun on his name, Graves. So I think it's just a really nice example of how we have an object in collections that can really be told through the letters that are associated with it as well. So that's one of my favorite objects for that.
It's a wonderful reading.
And so there are others that we can take a look at here. I just sort of selected some that might give a range of object types for the audience to get a sense of the types of things that not only were in the collections, but were also in some cases brought into collections to fulfill what we knew would have been appropriate for use. So in this case, we have a German student lamp, which was not within collections, something that you acquired. But the reason I put this in the plan is because there was a warranty. You see to the right here, from the German Student Lamp Company. This was from the Amherst Special Collections, and there's a poem written on this, as Dickinson tended to do, to write on little scraps of paper, right, on envelopes and all sorts of things. And so this is a really nice example of a piece of paper that was in the house that was saved because she wrote a poem on it. And if we look at the next image, we can see that that poem that she wrote on it, but then flipped it over and finished it on the front side. So it's, again, here's an example of something that was saved, and because of the warranty for this lamp, we know that it probably was something that was in the house. It made sense for her to have it in her bedroom. These were kerosene lamps designed to shed good light by having the reservoir for the kerosene separate from the wick, so there would be good light shining on the table, which I think for her would have been very important given her eye condition. So again, another example of use of the archives to help flesh out the plan. Another object and I would say this would be another memorable moment for me. It was opening this closet over at the Evergreens on the first floor in what was Susan and Austin's bedroom. Later, that was the bedroom where Austin died, and then now it's interpreted as the Emily room. Some of our viewers may have been in that space. But I love this because they're full of baskets. I happen to love baskets, but what was great about it is that a number of the baskets were Native American made, and that for me was also really telling and interesting because of letters that that Dickinson had written, making in one case referencing the fact that, as she put it, an Indian woman came to the back door with gay baskets and a baby. That's not the exact quote, but that was the gist of it. So she makes reference to this connection with this woman who had come to the door selling baskets. And this next image, you can see up close both the front and top of a small gift basket that has been decorated. These were peddled to directly to the both Dickinson households, and again, there's nice archival evidence both from the letters, but also from newspapers about the Native Americans coming to this area to camp out and to sell their wares, which included brooms in addition to baskets. And so this next image shows a broom, probably made from black ash or yellow birch, which was peeled down on both sides you can see that it's all one piece of wood here, splintered down and bound to create this hearth broom, and then shaved down to create the handle at the top as well. I love this object.
Yeah, I didn't realize that it was all one piece, that the bristles were not applied, but they were shaved down.
It's very cleverly made, very effective. And these were critical objects, everyday objects to use used in homes. That it's amazing in some ways that they survive here.
Yeah, this one, I remember seeing this one at a hearth in the Evergreens, right? It was, in the Emily room at that.
That's exactly
at
right.
that fireplace.
Yep, and there's another one as well that I believe is longer handle. So these were very practical, and they tended not to. They wore well, shall we say? And so if we go to another object type, this is a ceramic item. This is actually a base of a sauce boat. The pattern for this is Chiswick on the Thames. It's English made, English printed, made by Enoch Wood and Sons of Staffordshire, but it dates to about 1825. And there's a whole collection of this of these ceramic types that probably came as part of a crate of crockery discussed in a letter from Edward, Emily's father, to her mother, Emily, at the time that they were married, regarding the transportation of belongings for her dowry from her family from Munson, Massachusetts, where her mother came from, to Amherst. And so I really like this object because I like to imagine how this was used in the home. So this is, again, at the homestead, would have been in the dining room, probably used on the sideboard in the dining room, but also on the table. And this, you can see this scene on here includes a boat. And it's, I think, fun to think about Emily seeing this on display, eating from these ceramic wares, but seeing them on display on the sideboard as well. And then walking into the library, like we just saw, and seeing the books, and makes me think of her poem, "There is no frigate like a book."
Yes.
And I think it's a nice way to think about ways that the objects in Dickinson's home could have influenced her work. We sort of think of her as always being up in her head, and of course she was brilliant, but I think the surroundings and her material world was an important influence on her. And I just made that up, but I do think one can make a case for how the objects could have influenced her thinking. So that's why I wanted to include this. So, and then I mentioned the sideboard. This is a sideboard that is now at the Evergreens, but it originally was at the homestead in the dining room. And this also came from Munson as part of Emily Norcross Dickinson's dowry before she married Edward. A heavy piece, a great piece, but it eventually, and this kind of speaks to the way objects move back and forth in some cases between these two houses. This was eventually moved over to the Evergreens, to the dining room there. Susan Gilbert Dickinson talks about in her, she created an inventory in 1895, which is a really important source for the furnishings plan, because of that, we know what was in the house at that time. Inventories are great for that reason. And she references this sideboard as a family antique piece, and it had been sent over to the Evergreens, but she updated it. She added new hardware. There's Eastlake style hardware escutcheons on it. She added the brass surround at the top, and she also had a shelf, which you can't see in this image, but above it, mounted to the wall. So she adjusts it. She kind of makes it her own, but she also saw the value of it as a family piece. And this is the time after the centennial, when people are paying more attention to family pieces. They're pulling things out of chicken coops and attics and recognizing the value of family antiques. And I think that's partly what was happening when it was when she decided she would like to have it in her own dining room.
Right. Yeah. The inventories you mentioned, there's, one from 1895 and one that her daughter Martha wrote in 1922.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting about, especially Martha's, is she associates objects with family members.
Yes.
Which is just a wonderful.
It really is very helpful to know.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martha.
Yeah.
Yes. So we can move on to the next. This, I just put this Ottoman footstool in because it helps us to also get a sense of some of the other archival material that was helpful for the plan. So to the right, you see a purchase list from Doe Hazelton and Company in Boston. This is a list of furnishings that Susan and Austin had purchased prior to their marriage in 1856. And so this piece is listed on there. You don't see it on this image because it's on a separate page, but it is there. It's a black walnut ottoman. There are other pieces that match this, and this is still in the parlor at the Evergreens, along with other matching pieces. So again, just to give an example of how it's nice to combine the materials from the archive with the physical objects to get a sense of what it originally cost. In this case, I think it was $8. And then to see how it get changed over time, because clearly the family updated regularly. They kept the piece, but they changed the upholstery on it.
That receipt that again is one of those wonderful resources, because it's their first purchase of furniture, and they purchased a whole house full of furniture in one go.
That is right. And it's helpful to know what they were starting with and what's still there. So you go down that list and see, well, that is still in the family, that no longer is, or that got relegated to the maid's room. Yeah. And then there's just a couple of framed prints. Again, this shows up in Susan's 1895 inventory. These two prints, along with many other things, these were in the library at the Evergreens. Susan lists these as two colored engravings of Turkish scenes. She's actually incorrect on a couple of fronts, but we won't fault her for that. I mean, they're actually not engravings, but they're color lithographs, and they're also not Turkish, but rather Egyptian scenes. But that's okay. We still know what she meant. These date from the early 1870s. One is titled Arab Smoking a Pipe. The other is called Arab Market. Both based on watercolors by Karl Werner, who was born and trained in Germany and traveled throughout Egypt and Palestine and produced a lot of watercolors from which lithographs were made and sold. But Susan, I'm presuming it was Susan who determined that she wanted to have these in the library because they fit with an aesthetic that she was going for that was Orientalism as a sort of fad of the period, a term that was used. And there were a lot of things in the house that have that sort of aesthetic to it. And I think Emily even was quite aware of this as well. She almost at one point she was going to send flowers over, if I remember right, to Sue. There were her Turk's head flowers. She was going to send them over, and she said they will be comfortable in Susan's familiar East. So I think she sort of was thinking about, she knew the space, but there are many other objects that kind of tie in with that. And if we look at some of the next image, we can see, the types of, these are both examples of ads. These are a little bit later, late 19th, early 20th century ads for Van Hines, but we know that the Dickinsons shop there because they make reference to that in their letters. But you can see in some of the description here, well, maybe you can't, it's a little hard to see, but describing fans and the types of lamps that sort of fit into this aesthetic that I think that the Dickinsons were going for in this later part of the 19th century. And then the next image shows other examples of places where they shopped. This is W.J. Sloan. We know they bought carpets from there. This is a photograph of Sloan's in New York. And you can see the reference about two-thirds of the way down the page on the ad for Smyrna rugs. That same inventory from 1895 mentions several Smyrna rugs that were also in the library. So again, part of that aesthetic that she was going. And then we'll finish up here, Cookie, with the images, but this is a settee that was in the Evergreens parlor that had a yellow brocade upholstery on it. It seemed more appropriate for it to be at the homestead, given the date. So that was brought over here, and it is now in the homestead parlor, and the museum had that reupholstered in this beautiful black horsehair. So that's quite a gorgeous piece. Pay no attention to the pine cone. Essential museum element there.
A device.
It's a device.
To
we don't want people sitting on that.
Yeah, but this is a fabulous example of something that you identified as really not, it was not logical for it to have originated at the Evergreens, yet that's where it ended up because of the Dickinsons having to sell and then clear the homestead. So returning it to a more appropriate setting has been, that's an important function
to do that.
Of the furnishings.
And I like that this image shows the carpet. So you can see the carpet with the basket of flowers that we know based on something Martha had written about I believe in Recollections of the Country Girl about the carpet, and she describes it. And so that really helped in recreating this beautiful Brussels wall-to-wall carpet. This room has never felt right to me until it had this carpet in it. It just has the right feel to it. Yes. And so then I think there's just maybe one more. Yes. So the final image that I want to show is this fire screen on the left, which is something once again shows up in the inventories. This was created by Susan. This is Berlin wool work, which is a form of embroidery very much like what we think of as needlepoint. And it's framed in this walnut frame, but also it's in the form of a fire screen. So it can be raised and lowered to be used in front of a fireplace for preventing too much heat when you're sitting in front of it. But I think this was really more for display than it was for any function in front of a fireplace. This shows up in the Evergreens library in the one photograph of that space from the 1870s.
Yes.
It shows up in the inventory that Susan had done in 1895 in the hall over at the Evergreens. But it's a marvelous piece that demonstrates her ability with the needle. And for a long time, we just presumed, we knew Susan had done it based on Martha's description in her inventory, because I think she says, my mother's.
Yes.
So that's how we knew for sure that Susan had done it. But we weren't sure if she made up the design herself or if she used a template, or it was one of the things we could kind of guess about. But very recently, because of the work that Megan Ramsey has been working with the collections and the materials, she came across a pattern for the fire screen. So we now know that Susan was using this pattern. She very accurately reproduced. You can see how beautiful the pattern is. In addition to the work that Susan did, it's a little bit faded, her version, but how wonderful to be continually finding examples in collections that relate to the furnishings that can then be interpreted. So I think that's a nice way to end and to look forward to the types of things that the museum is still doing to process all of these materials in the collections.
Thank you. Yeah, right. Thank you, Nan. And Megan Ramsey, our collections manager, has just joined the conversation. And so, what was when you saw that fire screen pattern? What was your reaction?
I don't know if I had seen the fire screen yet, actually, because
Yeah,
I saw that very
Yep.
early in the project. And when I saw the pattern, I was amazed by the colors. It's just so vibrant. And then when I came to the Evergreens and saw the screen, I was like, why does this look so familiar? And yeah, I just made the connection, since I've been through every piece in the collection at this point, that I was able to make that connection, that this is the actual pattern of this piece.
Yeah.
It's really exciting.
Yeah. So do you have, Megan, do you have some thoughts or things to add to some of the objects that we've just been through with Nan?
I have to say the settee, I think, is one of my favorite stories of this recent restoration, and because of the furnishings plan, knowing that it should have come back to the homestead and that we were able to conserve it and get it reupholstered and bring it back to its former glory. I think it's such a showcase piece, and it's really exciting to be able to do that.
And have you ever sat on it?
No,
Oh,
of
good.
course not. Of course not.
That's why the pine
Yeah.
cones.
That's why the pine
You
cones
probably would have
there.
slid off had you sat on it. There, you have to sit just right, or you end up on the floor on that horsehair.
Yeah, it's a very
Requires posture.
narrow pad also,
Yeah.
isn't it?
I don't think the Victorians were ever very comfortable.
They probably. So can you tell us a little bit more about this, about what you're seeing, what you're coming across in the cataloging project?
Yeah.
And where you see the connections from objects you're finding to the furnishings plan as you've come to know it.
Yeah, I think, we're going to keep making more and more connections from things that you found in all of your research in this, in the furnishings plan, with the things that we're finding kind of that were deep down in the collections that you weren't able to see during your research. So for the past 3 years, we've been going through systematically, box by box, object by object, cataloging every single object for the first time. So we're reporting descriptions, location, dimensions, kind of all of the physical aspects of individual objects. We're not able to do the research that you did. We're not able to figure out those connections just yet, since we're trying to basically get our own inventory, that 1895 inventory that Sue made. We're kind of making our own modern version of that, including photographs, which is really key. So with the help of our collections assistant, Caitlin McGrath, as well as lots of interns, we've been through over 7,600 objects so far, and we're still not done. We have the rest of the summer to go. We're working on textiles right now, so everything from clothing to table linens and bed linens. Basically everything the house has that's made of textiles, we have it in the collection. So we still have several hundred objects to go, but we'll be finished up later this summer.
Yeah, one thing that is, I think, so important to me in hearing you describe these kinds of small objects and the quality of them that you're uncovering is that at the time we did the furnishings plan, I think I mentioned I was sort of overwhelmed by the number of objects that had to be revealed and understood. And we didn't have time right then to do the kind of course, kind of what Megan was doing. So the furnishings plan Some of the things that we weren't able to pay as much attention to at that time were the smalls, small objects that are certainly characteristic of a definitely fully furnished and perhaps overly furnished Victorian home, but they're also the things that convey the little tidbits about daily life. And so this collections cataloging project is kind of freeing the collection for us to be able to mine further and to expand upon the wonderful work of the furnishings plan. So where do you think we should start with that, Megan?
Oh, there's so many options. I mean, the things we found that are all of the little nitty gritty things. So one thing we did put on display during the recent restoration was a sewing basket with little notions and trim. And then we also found a needle book that has SHD on it for Susan Huntington Dickinson. And it's just a little needle case, little, piece of fabric folded in half that she monogrammed her initials on. And so that kind of creates just a little evocative moment there in the upper hall, in the homestead of, perhaps someone was sitting here sewing next to this beautiful window. And I think we have such an opportunity after this cataloging project to create more of those moments throughout the houses.
Yeah. So I want to just take just a moment to think about furnishings plan and this recent restoration at the homestead. So at the very kind of beginning of this conversation, I mentioned that our efforts in those early years were really focused on uniting every aspect of the homestead and the Evergreens that we could think about. So when it comes to restoration, that has a lot to do with the structure, of course, and then there's the backdrop, the decorative finishes, the wallpapers and the floor coverings and so forth, the canvas on which the objects are then set. So the two sort of planning vectors come together. They have to come together to create an effective restoration. And the more research, which is, as you have described your process, is very painstaking, both with objects, and it's just as painstaking with the structure and looking for the clues to the decorative finishes. So it is it's a lengthy process and a marvelously rewarding one. So being able to see the impact of the furnishings plan here in this entire main block of the homestead, it's been a dream, and it got its start, I think, with your work. So I appreciate that. So Megan, future projects. What's up next with collections?
Oh, there's a lot to do still. So this cataloging project is really kind of creating this baseline skeletal record of what we have, but there's still lots to do. One of the first things we'd like to do is similar to what Nan did, is diving into those archives and then matching those with the records that we just created. So the student lamp with warranty, having that record from Amherst College connected to our record of the student lamp that we have in the collections, so that we can make those connections on our database. In our database,
so that information, those connections, then become available to any researcher.
Yes.
I mean, we of course use it internally, but then it becomes available to others.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be really key to continue our storytelling and interpretation of the space and understanding of the whole Dickinson family.
So the work that you're doing now, Megan, cataloging the hundreds and hundreds of kitchen implements, kind of leads to another bit of a restoration story. What's next in restoring the homestead and kind of stabilizing the Evergreens. So The remaining portion of the homestead that hasn't yet been restored and will create a third and final, what we expect to be a third and final phase of restoration, is the rear addition, which houses, in the Dickinson's day, housed their kitchen, their laundry or washroom, and a shed, a wood shed. And above that, rooms whose their function hasn't ever turned up in any document that I have found, or perhaps that you have found, but it is presumed, it is logical to assume that that's where some of the household help, where they had their rooms, their living quarters, with easy access to the sort of the hard working portion of the house. So that area, the ground floor, first floor, and the second floor will be restored in another phase, as well as the dining room and the space above that, which we believe was Edward and Emily Morehouse' room, the room they occupied. So the timetable on that is a little uncertain, but it's the next important project involving the homestead and restoration. Over at the Evergreens, we're completing a collections related project at the Evergreens, but it's not exactly what you might expect as a collections related project. And that really is to improve the environment in that structure, to safely display our collections objects, especially the very sensitive objects such as oil paintings and upholstered furniture. Correcting the goal there is to correct the wild swings in temperature and humidity that does such damage to, especially to fragile and sensitive objects of that sort. But the Evergreens, it still retains its late 19th and early 20th century finishes from one of Susan's last decorating campaigns, and that's the way we would like to pass that along to posterity. So let's see. Is there one last announcement you'd like to make about a database and what's happening with that?
Yes. So at the culmination of this cataloging project later this summer, all of the work that we've been doing on our database, all of the records, all of the photographs, we'll be publishing on our website, so everyone will have access to the records that we created, and all of the images that you saw today, all of those are in our database. So all of these records are going to be available on our website for everyone for free. Everyone around the world, anyone who can access our website will be able to see the database itself. So it's not set up quite yet, but that's what we're working on this summer, and it's a really exciting venture for the museum and for the future of Dickinson scholarship in general.
Wonderful. Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Nan. I think we can take some questions now, and I know there are a few in the Q&A, and if those of you joining us online have other questions that you'd like to add in, we'll take as many as we can. So one question: are there more objects like the German student lamp receipt that was kept because of her poem, but ended up providing more insight into the house and its inventory? Let's see. That's a good question. There are some things about lifeways. For example, the poem that's written on the back of a chocolate wrapper. Yeah. You know, that tells us something about goods that the Dickinson family had access to, and perhaps what the direction of their sweet tooth, in addition to black cake, coconut cake, and gingerbread. So that's one the one that I can think of immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not coming up with any other. This again, I keep saying this is a while ago, so I'm sure there are others. But in terms of some of the materials that I looked at, in terms of what they were purchasing, it was interesting to see the Cutler store accounts and get a sense of what the family was acquiring. They bought an awful lot of kerosene and wicks, so they were, I think they were readers. Have a lot of lamps. So it was fun to think about that aspect of their lives, so daily lives, not just the fact that they were acquiring. And it's not really what the questioner is asking, but it's helpful. I mean, just to think about the kinds of the connections between some of the materials and daily life. The fact that they were purchasing these goods, but also who's doing all the cleaning of those lamps. That's what I always like to think about. That's hard work, and you know that they had help to do that kind of labor. So, you know, to get the full picture of what was going on in the households.
Yeah, I guess there are just a couple of other things I could mention that are kind of related, but they're not the same example as the warranty for the German student lamp. But there is another poem that Dickinson decorated with a stamp, and then had cut out just a short phrase from a publication and made a little figure. And I think that was on Alone in a Circumstance, I believe. So, you know, tracking down, you know, understanding what postal regulations were at the time, tracking down the source of the cutout from the book. You know, that's another indication of kind of life ways and interests. And then, of course, Dickinson famously enclosed flowers in notes and poems as well, and I think a fly or a bee at one time. So all of these little clues do help us with life ways.
Yeah, I'm just remembering a great poem with the flower. That actually a copy of a poem that we have a few poems at the American Antiquarian Society, Dickinson poems. And there's one of my favorites is one that has a dandelion. Goes, you know, from her having pressed dandelion.
Oh yes, yeah. And there is that poem, The Dandelion's Pallid Tube.
Yes, that's the one. Yes.
The settee that we looked at, there's a question about whether it's a French from the Empire period, and wood. Do we know that?
The wood is mahogany veneer, and yes, it is from the Empire period. But yes, it's a great piece. It's beautiful, and I don't know when you did the restoration work if you had to have much conservation work done on the wood or not. Did you?
No,
I
very
remember it being very good.
Yeah,
condition.
very good condition.
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember a lot of loss in the veneer either. So despite being in the Evergreens for all those years, it seemed to have held up pretty well.
There's a question about this is one more generally about collections. How does transporting these materials and objects work? What are the differences between transporting more delicate, smaller objects and larger pieces like furniture? And you've had a lot of experience with this.
Both. So the larger pieces we actually contract with a fine art shipper who they wrap everything and pad it as much as possible and strap it down to make sure it doesn't move around in shipping. And then with smaller objects, we make sure that we have some type of container, usually some type of box, and make sure that they're padded out so that in transport they don't bounce around or anything. So basically we treat everything as if it's fragile and breakable, since they are. And it just depends on, you know, do we put it in a container inside of a container, or the large furniture pieces, really, you know, treat the truck as a container and pad it out on the side.
Let's see, the collections database will be so wonderful. I think I've there it is. Okay. Will the German lamp be on display? And has anything been recently cataloged relating to a newer set of pieces, old ones cracked? So the German student lamp is on the writing stand in Emily Dickinson's room. So it can be seen. Can be seen right now. Let's see, the porcelain. So there are a lot of ceramics in the collection, and there's one particular set that is it's a French porcelain that is a white with a gold band, and that was Emily Norcross Dickinson's set. But you may have some other. And pieces of that are on display in the house, not the entire set.
Yeah, with teacups and saucers on display. But we have hundreds of pieces of ceramic. So I think the frigate piece is like really interesting to think about that as an individual piece that could inspire a poem, not just as the saucer of a tureen. So I think it'll be exciting to think of other ways to incorporate some of these smaller objects more on display.
Yeah, and there's another set of porcelain that Susan and Austin had. It was the gold band, white, very similar to what Norcross, the tea set that Emily Norcross had. So there's a fair amount of that.
There are multiple sets, large sets of dinner service and tea services at the Evergreens, including some blue and white Chinese export porcelain. There's also a set of Japanese porcelain and another set of earthenware.
There's the Copeland set that was Susan's, the brown
transfer. Yeah. Brown transfer and blue transfer.
Well, I mean, there were two separate families. There were the blue would have been Emily Norcross and Edwards, right? And then they probably had other, we're talking about generations of use. And then Susan and Austin had their set that she picked out, but they added to it over time. I mean, that's quite a sizable set for dining. So yes, we have to remember we're talking about two separate families. So it sounds like a lot. And yes, there's separate tea service and then dining ware, and within dining ware you have your everyday and your better. So it's a lot. Yeah,
quite a bit. Yeah, you can portray different food services at either house in the future. Let's see, there's a question. Have you found any more wallpaper remnants in unrestored rooms yet? We have a chance to. We haven't found. Let's see. We haven't found any others in the unrestored rooms. So some of that work, some of those discoveries take place when we get pretty close to the point of doing the restoration work, because that's kind of the last stage of investigation. And that gets done sometimes at the time that we're developing some schematics or design ideas for a restoration. So some of the forensic investigation happens early on, and in fact we've done some in some of the spaces that are yet to be restored, but we haven't taken things apart as thoroughly as we'll need to at the time we do the restoration. So there's a chance, but we're not quite there. Let's see. Are there any projects underway with the landscaping or gardens? Well, this year we've in the last year or so, while the museum was closed, we did one kind of landscaping project that was to reinstate the path between the homestead and the Evergreens. They stand about 100 yards apart, and the path between the houses, it is said that Emily Dickinson referred to it as a path just wide enough for two who love. And there are photographs that that her niece Martha published in books about Dickinson that illustrate it in that sense. And so we have reinstated that path between the two, and that's a nice link between the two houses. And there's also an accessible path, which enhances its functions for us. There's been some clearing of the slope between the two houses, and there will later this year be some more project work around the perimeter of the property. And we still look forward to a fuller restoration of Emily Dickinson's gardens, based on plant lists that have been developed by different scholars, including Marta McDowell. And that project will, that also is in our future. So let's, how were the items in the Evergreens preserved over the years? Did the owners, after Sue and Austin, keep the artifacts in storage? So there is that's a tale. There's, I had seen a question a little bit earlier asking about why so many objects were at the Evergreens. And so that's kind of related to this question. And the short answer to that one is that Martha Dickinson Bianchi inherited the homestead after her Aunt Emily, her Aunt Lavinia, her own father died. And after her mother died, she found that she needed to sell the house. And so she moved furnishings from the homestead over to the Evergreens, the ones that meant much to the family as a kind of for sentimental reasons. Other things she sold or gave away. So the Evergreens, being her own residence, that became the repository of items from the homestead. So how were those objects stored and preserved after Martha's death? Well, she left the Evergreens to a family associate, a literary assistant, who and his spouse. He married later, and after, and they basically they had such fondness for Martha Dickinson Bianchi that they kept the house pretty much as she had left it. And they kind of arranged their own life in the house around what Martha had left there in place. And it just remained that way until the death of the spouse in 1988. And at that time, it became, it was intended to be developed as a cultural facility. So those objects have been in place at the Evergreens since the Dickinson's time, until we've gotten to this catalog project.
Pretty amazing.
It is. It's wonderful. Well, I think we can thank you both, Nan and Megan, for this really fascinating behind-the-scenes look at the collections and how they're coming into their own now as we bring them out. And we thank all of you for joining us this evening for this part 1 in the series. And we hope that you'll stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 coming to your computer screens later this summer with other special guests and project updates. So stay tuned, check in on our website for when those will be scheduled, and we'll hope you'll join us for those. I want to take a moment to mention 2 programs that are upcoming just in the next few weeks. May 3rd at 7 p.m., just next week, is a program titled Color Cast Denomination, after the line of an Emily Dickinson poem. And this program looks at the context, Emily Dickinson's context of race and class in Amherst. And you can, at that program, 7 p.m., May 3rd, you can hear research from 4 museum guides who have taken on special projects to research race and class context in Amherst. And then May 13th is our annual Emily Dickinson Poetry Walk. This returns to an in-person, on-site program for the 137th anniversary of Emily Dickinson's death in 1886. We hope to see you at either or both of those programs. To learn more about the Emily Dickinson and our programs, please visit our website. And I hope you'll also maybe consider making a donation so we can keep bringing these kinds of behind-the-scenes experiences to you on Zoom and in person. So we thank you very much for being with us. We wish you a good night, and we'll see you soon.